In the spring of 1944, a young woman leapt from a British plane into the dark skies above Nazi-occupied Europe. Her name was Hannah Szenes, Hungarian-born poet, freedom fighter, and one of the few Jewish paratroopers trained in Palestine. Her mission to rescue her people from the fires of the Holocaust. Hannah Szenes was born on July 17, 1921, in Budapest, Hungary, into a family of talent and intellect. Her father, Béla Szenes, was a well-known playwright and journalist, celebrated for his wit and creativity. He died when Hannah was only 6 years old, leaving her mother, Catherine, to raise Hannah and her brother alone. From an early age, Hannah's brilliance was evident. She attended one of Budapest's most prestigious schools, the Bar Mattis Protestant Gymnasium, where she quickly stood out for her intelligence, discipline, and strong moral conviction. But as the 1930s unfolded, Hungary began to tighten its alliance with Nazi Germany, and anti-Semitism crept steadily into every part of life. Laws were passed that limited Jewish participation in schools, professions, and the arts. For a girl like Hannah, who dreamed of achievement and fairness, these restrictions were suffocating. Despite the growing hostility, Hannah excelled. She wrote poetry that spoke of longing, justice, and identity. But as her country changed, so too did her sense of belonging. By 1938, the Hungarian government had passed its first anti-Jewish laws, restricting Jews from higher education and professional positions. Hannah realized that no matter how talented or loyal she was, Hungary no longer had a place for her. She began to study the ideals of Zionism, the belief in a Jewish homeland where Jews could live free and secure. The movement, spreading rapidly across Europe, became a beacon of hope for thousands of young Jews who felt trapped between assimilation and persecution. Hannah joined a Zionist youth group called Maccabea, where she learned about life in Palestine, about building communities, and about a new identity rooted not in fear but in purpose. In 1939, when she was 18, she made the decision that would change her life. She applied to study at the Nahalal Agricultural School in Palestine, part of the Jewish Agency's efforts to train young immigrants to build a future in the land that would one day become Israel. She left Budapest in 1939, just weeks before the outbreak of World War II, carrying with her little more than her notebooks and a fierce determination to contribute to her people's destiny. The voyage was long, passing through a Europe on the brink of war. But when she arrived in Palestine, she found a world alive with energy and vision. The kibbutz she joined was filled with young men and women from across Europe. Refugees, dreamers, idealists, all working the land, learning Hebrew, and building a new life under the hot Mediterranean sun. At Nahalal, Hannah learned agriculture, irrigation, and community leadership. She also continued to write, filling her journals with poetry that captured the struggle between exile and belonging. Yet even as she embraced this new life, the shadow of Europe grew darker. The Nazi war machine advanced through the continent, and by 1941, Hungarian Jews were under severe restrictions. Hannah's mother was still in Budapest, and mothers between them became increasingly anxious. In 1942, the reports from Europe turned to horror: the ghettos, the deportations, the extermination camps. In Palestine, the Jewish community, known as the Yishuv, watched helplessly as 6 million of their people faced annihilation. Hannah could not stand by. When the British Special Operations Executive and the Jewish Agency for Palestine began recruiting volunteers for a daring plan, she was among the first to step forward. The mission, later known as the Paratroopers of the Yishuv, aimed to train a select group of Jewish men and women in espionage, communications, and survival skills. These agents would be parachuted behind enemy lines in occupied Europe to assist Allied operations, gather intelligence, and aid Jewish communities still trapped under Nazi rule. Out of thousands of applicants, only 110 were accepted. Hannah Szenes was one of them, and one of only a handful of women. Her training began in 1943. At British bases in Egypt and later in Palestine, she learned Morse code, navigation, sabotage techniques, and parachuting. She studied how to pass as a civilian under Nazi control, memorizing false identities and mastering radio transmission methods that could mean the difference between life and death. She was known for her quiet determination, her calm under pressure, and her unwavering sense of purpose. Her instructors, both British and Jewish, noted her exceptional discipline and clarity of mission. She wrote in her diary during training, "There is only one thing greater than the will to live, the will to be free." By the spring of 1944, the mission was ready. The Allied command had approved the deployment of Jewish Paratroopers into Yugoslavia, where partisan forces led by Josip Broz Tito were resisting the Nazis. From there, the operatives could attempt to cross into Hungary to make contact with Jewish communities and rescue downed Allied airmen. On March 14, 1944, Hannah and her two comrades, Reuven Daphne and Yol Palji, boarded a Royal Air Force plane bound for Yugoslavia. They jumped from 13,000 feet under cover of night, descending into a land torn apart by occupation and resistance. The landing was rough, and Hannah's radio was damaged, but she survived. The trio was taken in by Yugoslav partisans, who were skeptical at first, but eventually accepted them as allies. For 3 months, Hannah lived among the partisans in the forests of Croatia. Supplies were scarce, communication was dangerous, and Nazi patrols prowled the countryside. Yet she continued her work, repairing radios, coding messages, and preparing for the next phase of her mission. Meanwhile, the situation in Hungary worsened dramatically. On March 19, 1944, Germany occupied Hungary, ending the government's fragile independence. Within weeks, Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest to oversee the deportation of Hungarian Jews. In less than 2 months, more than 400,000 Jews were sent to Auschwitz. It was one of the most rapid and brutal deportations of the Holocaust. Hannah knew that time was running out. In June 1944, she decided to cross the border into Hungary. Despite warnings from her comrades that it was suicide, she was determined. Her plan was to make contact with the underground Jewish rescue network in Budapest, transmit messages to the British, and help organize escapes. With her British uniform hidden beneath civilian clothes and forged papers identifying her as a Yugoslav peasant, she set out on foot toward the Drava River, the natural border between Yugoslavia and Hungary. The crossing was treacherous. Swift currents, German patrols, and barbed wire fences. But on June 9, she waded into the cold water with her small radio set sealed in a waterproof bag. Before she could reach the opposite bank, she was captured by Hungarian gendarmes. At first, she claimed to be a Yugoslav courier, but her accent and papers aroused suspicion. She was taken to a prison in Szombathely, near the Austrian border, where the Gestapo soon realized she was a British, trained spy. When they found her radio equipment, they knew she was part of an Allied operation. From that moment on, the interrogations began. Hannah was beaten, deprived of food, and tortured. The officers demanded that she give up the codes to her transmitter and the names of her fellow agents. She refused. Even when they brought her mother, Catherine, into the prison, to pressure her, she remained silent. Her captors told her that unless she talked, her mother would suffer. Hannah looked at her and said calmly, "I can't. I must not." For months, she was held in solitary confinement. She kept her spirit alive through prayer and poetry, scratching verses on the wall and whispering them to herself in the dark. One of her most famous poems, written during imprisonment, begins, "Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame." It would become her final testament, a symbol of sacrifice and resistance. In October 1944, as the Red Army approached Hungary's borders, Hannah was transferred to a military prison in Budapest. The Nazi regime was collapsing, but in its final desperation, it continued to execute prisoners deemed traitors or spies. Her trial was swift, carried out by a Hungarian military tribunal loyal to the Germans. She was charged with treason for having joined the enemy and crossing the border illegally. The British tried to intervene, but with Hungary in chaos, no help could reach her. On November 7, 1944, at just 23 years old, Hannah Szenes was led to the courtyard of the prison. Refusing the blindfold offered to her, she faced the firing squad with open eyes. Witnesses reported that she stood tall, unshaken, and that her final words were a quiet prayer in Hebrew. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave, and her mother was left with only rumors of her death until the war ended. In 1950, her remains were exhumed and brought to Israel, where she was buried with full military honors on Mount Herzl, the National Cemetery in Jerusalem. In the years that followed, Hannah Szenes became a symbol of courage, devotion, and the human spirit's refusal to surrender. Her diaries and poems, recovered after the war, revealed the depth of her character. A young woman who loved life, who feared death, but who believed in something greater than either. Her writings offer a rare glimpse into the mind of someone who walked knowingly into the heart of danger, not for glory or revenge, but for the hope that even one life might be saved. Her story is intertwined with that of the 32 other Jewish parachutists who served the same mission. Of them, 12 were captured, and 7, including Hannah, were executed. Their legacy lives on not only in military history, but in the collective memory of a people who refused to disappear. Decades later, historians pieced together the details of her final mission from military records, testimonies, and her own journals. It became clear that her courage had extended far beyond her final moments. While imprisoned, she refused to betray her comrades, saving countless others from arrest and execution. The codes she protected were later confirmed to have been vital to the Allied communication network operating in the Balkans. In 1993, the Israeli government officially recognized her as one of the heroes of the Jewish resistance during World War II. Schools, streets, and youth movements were named after her, and her poetry was set to music, recited in classrooms, and sung at memorials. Her poem, A Walk to Caesarea, written before her final mission, became one of Israel's most beloved songs. It begins, my God, may it never end, the sand and the sea, the rustle of the water, the brilliance of the sky. The words capture not the image of a warrior, but of a young woman who cherished the beauty of life, even as she faced its destruction. For those who survived, her story was a light in the darkness, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable evil, there were those who chose courage over fear, sacrifice over silence. Her mother, Catherine, lived until 1992. She spent decades ensuring her daughter's legacy was remembered, compiling her writings and sharing them with the world. Through her efforts, the image of Hannah Szenes became not only that of a martyr, but of a complete human being. A poet, a dreamer, and a soldier whose life was short but whose impact was eternal. Today, her story stands as one of the most powerful chapters in the history of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. It is told not in numbers or statistics, but in the quiet strength of a single voice that refused to be silenced. In every account, from the forests of Yugoslavia to the prison cells of Budapest, the same theme echoes: a young woman who understood that freedom demanded more than words. Her courage was not born of recklessness, but of conviction that life without liberty was no life at all. The darkness of that era swallowed millions, but her flame, small, steadfast, and unyielding, continues to burn through history. The girl who fell from the sky did not live to see victory, but her fall was not in vain. She became a symbol of resistance, a voice for the voiceless, and a reminder that even in humanity's darkest night, there were those who chose to stand and fight. After Hannah Szenes' execution in November 1944, the final months of the war brought devastation to the land she had fought to reach. Budapest became one of the last battlegrounds in Europe. German forces, aided by the Hungarian Arrow Cross militia, turned the city into a fortress, determined to hold it at any cost. As the Red Army advanced from the east, tens of thousands of civilians were trapped in the siege that began in December. Hunger, disease, and violence spread through the capital. The Jewish community, already decimated by deportations, faced a final wave of terror. The Arrow Cross dragged men, women, and children from the ghetto to the banks of the Danube, where they were shot and their bodies thrown into the river. Amid the chaos, some of Hannah's former contacts in the underground rescue network continued their efforts, using false papers and safe houses to save what lives they could. By January 1945, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Budapest. The battle raged for weeks, house by house, as German and Hungarian troops resisted fiercely. When the city finally fell in February, it lay in ruins. More than 80% of the Bud damaged, and an estimated 38,000 civilians had died. Out of Hungary's per-war Jewish population of nearly 825,000, only about 255,000 survived. The Red Army liberated the remaining Jews of Budapest, but for many, freedom came too late. Families had been shattered, entire communities erased, and the memory of those who resisted, like Hannah, was still buried beneath the rubble of war. In the months that followed, Allied investigators and Jewish organizations began the monumental task of documenting the destruction. Lists of survivors were compiled, testimonies collected, and mass graves uncovered. Among the scattered reports were references to a young woman executed as a British agent. Her name appeared in several prison ledgers and Hungarian military documents. It was only after the liberation that her mother, Szenes, learned the truth. She had survived the siege of Budapest, sheltering in cellars and living on scraps of food. When the war ended, she searched tirelessly for her daughter, visiting government offices and prisons, asking anyone who might have known her. Eventually, a former prisoner who had shared a cell with Hannah told her what had happened. He described how she had faced death calmly, refusing to betray her companions. Catherine listened in silence, holding back tears, and then began the long journey to honor her memory. In 1945, as the Nuremberg trials began to uncover the machinery of the Nazi regime, the story of the Jewish parachutists emerged slowly through military reports and survivor testimonies. The British Special Operations Executive documented the missions carried out by Jewish volunteers from Palestine. Out of the 110 trained agents, 37 had been deployed in Europe. Many operated in Yugoslavia, Greece, Slovakia, and Italy. Some, like Reuven Daphne and Yoel Palgi, returned alive. Others disappeared behind enemy lines. Their operations had mixed results: communication failures, shifting front lines, and the rapid collapse of German forces made coordination nearly impossible. Yet their courage stood out. They had volunteered to return to the very lands from which they had fled, fully aware that capture meant certain death. In post-war Palestine, their names were spoken with reverence. The Yishuv saw in them the embodiment of Jewish resistance, a defiance that contrasted with the helplessness imposed upon Europe's Jews. Memorial ceremonies were held, and the Palmach, the elite strike force of the Haganah, recorded their stories in military archives. Hannah's name appeared often, both for her bravery and for the poems she left behind. Her writings were found among her belongings, preserved by her comrades in the training camps. The verses spoke not of hatred but of faith and resilience. They were published in small pamphlets and passed from hand to hand among soldiers and young immigrants. Her diary, written in a clear and steady hand, recounted her thoughts during training, her fears before the mission, and her unwavering belief in the future of her people. As Europe struggled to rebuild, the Jewish survivors who reached Palestine carried the weight of their losses. The British Mandate, still in control of the territory, restricted immigration despite the horrors revealed by the war. Ships crowded with refugees were turned back, internment camps were established in Cyprus, and tensions grew between the Jewish population and the British authorities. The story of the parachutists became a rallying symbol for those demanding a homeland of their own. They were held up as proof that Jews had not gone silently to their deaths but had fought, resisted, and died with honor. In 1946, a small ceremony was held at Kibbutz Sdot Yam, where Hannah had once lived. Her friends gathered around a simple memorial stone engraved with her name. They read her poems aloud and sang the melodies she had loved. The kibbutz members planted trees in her memory, each representing one of the parachutists who had not returned. The ceremonies grew over the years, becoming part of a larger national remembrance. When Israel declared independence in 1948, Hannah's story was already woven into the fabric of the new state. In 1950, her remains were brought from Hungary to Israel. The mission was coordinated by the Israeli Defense Ministry and involved the cooperation of the Hungarian authorities. After careful identification, through personal artifacts and official records, her coffin was flown to Tel Aviv and then carried to Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. Thousands of people attended the funeral. Soldiers, poets, students, and Holocaust survivors stood side by side as the flag of Israel was draped over her coffin. Military honors were rendered, and her mother stood at the graveside, silent and composed, as the crowd sang her daughter's song, Ali, Li. The words rose above the crowd, blending grief with pride. My God, may it never end. The sand and the sea, the rustle of the water, the brilliance of the sky. In the following decades, Hannah Szenes' life was studied by historians, educators, and artists. Her writings were published in multiple languages, and her story became part of the curriculum in Israeli schools. Plays, films, and documentaries retold her journey from Budapest to Palestine, from poet to paratrooper. Yet even as her legend grew, researchers continued to uncover new details. British archives revealed the full scope of the parachutists of the Yishuv mission. Declassified documents showed the complexity of the operation, how political tensions between the British authorities and the Jewish agency had sometimes hindered coordination, and how, despite limited success in their objectives, the moral and symbolic impact of the missions far outweighed their military results. In the 1960s, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem revived global attention to the Holocaust and to the resistance efforts that had taken place within it. Witnesses testified about the destruction of Hungarian Jewry, about the deportations, and about the individuals who had tried to fight back. Among the exhibits were references to the parachutists, and Hannah's name once again appeared in official testimony. Survivors who had been in Budapest during 1944 recalled hearing rumors about a young woman captured while trying to reach the underground. They spoke of her courage and the silence she maintained under torture. For many, she came to represent not only defiance, but also the bridge between the old world that perished and the new one that rose from its ashes. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, her poetry found renewed meaning. Musicians adapted her verses into songs that were performed at memorials and national ceremonies. Her diary was reissued with annotations, providing historical context to each entry. It revealed the duality of her life, her longing for peace and her acceptance of war as a necessity in defense of her people. Her words were not of conquest but of preservation, a record of a generation forced to fight for its right to exist. Meanwhile, historians delved deeper into the network that supported the parachutists. They traced how the British Special Operations Executive had coordinated with the Haganah Intelligence Service, and how Jewish volunteers had served across multiple theaters of war. In Greece, agents had helped organize partisan units. In Slovakia, they had aided the uprising against the Germans, and in Yugoslavia, they had established radio links between Allied command and the local resistance. Hannah's mission was one thread in this vast network, but her youth and her literary talent made her story stand apart. As the world moved further from the events of World War II, archives opened and testimonies were digitized. Researchers found letters exchanged between the British command and the Jewish agency discussing her capture. They discovered notes indicating that the British had made attempts, through diplomatic channels, to secure her release, but by the time the requests reached Hungary, the German occupation had sealed the country off from the outside world. These documents confirmed that her execution had taken place just weeks before Soviet troops entered Budapest, adding a final layer of tragedy to her story. In 1993, the State of Israel posthumously awarded Hannah Szenes the Medal of Valor, the highest military decoration. The citation recognized her courage in volunteering for a mission from which she knew she might never return. Her refusal to betray her comrades, and her moral strength under torture. Her story was added to Israel's officiatory of national heroes. schools held ceremonies on the anniversary of her death, and the parachutists' training base in Ramat David was named in their honor. Her poems were inscribed on memorials, and her diary was displayed in museums alongside artifacts from the resistance. Beyond Israel, her legacy spread through the Jewish diaspora. In Hungary, after decades of silence under communist rule, her name began to reappear in public memory. Streets and schools were named after her, and exhibitions told her story as part of the broader history of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust. In 1992, a statue of Szenes was unveiled in Budapest, not far from the Danube where so many victims had perished. Her mother, then 90 years old, was too frail to attend but sent a letter of thanks, expressing hope that her daughter's life would continue to inspire compassion and courage. She passed away later that year, having lived long enough to see her daughter's memory restored in the country of her birth. As new generations learned her story, filmmakers and writers revisited the events that had shaped her mission. They explored the world she had left behind in Budapest, the cafes, the schools, the youth movements, and the landscape of Palestine in the 1930s and 1940s, where idealism and survival intertwined. The diaries and letters she exchanged with her mother became central to understanding her humanity, her doubts, and her steadfast resolve. These intimate writings revealed the personal cost of war, the weight of separation, and the quiet strength of a young woman who refused to be defined by fear. Today, historians continue to study the broader implications of her mission. They examine how the parachutists of the Yishuv represented an early example of Jewish participation in Allied intelligence and how their operations influenced later Israeli military doctrine. The courage shown by these volunteers helped shape the ethos of the young nation: self-reliance, sacrifice, and the belief that the defense of one's people is a sacred duty. Hannah's name stands among those who gave their lives to make that belief a reality. Her story endures not only in books and museums, but in the quiet rituals of remembrance. At Mount Herzl, her grave remains one of the most visited sites on the hill. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, schoolchildren place flowers on her tomb, reciting her poems and reading excerpts from her diary. Survivors who once knew her visit to share memories of her laughter, her resolve, and her unwavering hope. Among them are descendants of those she sought to save, people who owe their lives to the network she joined, and the courage that carried her into occupied Europe. The preservation of her legacy has also taken digital form. Her writings have been digitized by the National Library of Israel, her radio training manuals preserved in British archives, and her personal effects. Her watch, her notebook, her uniform, displayed in museums. Scholars analyze her poetry alongside other wartime writers, exploring how her words reflected both a personal faith and a collective destiny. Each discovery adds a new layer to her story, illuminating the woman behind the legend, the poet behind the soldier. In the decades since her fall from the sky, the world has changed beyond recognition. Yet the questions she embodied remain: what it means to resist, to act when silence seems safer, to believe that a single life can carry meaning amid destruction. Her journey from the classrooms of Budapest to the skies over Europe, from the fields of Nahalal to the prison cells of Budapest, traces not only one woman's fate, but an entire generation's struggle for identity and survival. The story of Szenes continues to echo through time. It is carried in the melodies of her songs, in the pages of her diary, in the silent reverence of those who stand before her grave. She fell from the sky into a world consumed by darkness, but her fall became a spark that refused to die. Through history's long night, that spark endures, steady, enduring, and alive in every heart that remembers her name. In the years after the turn of the century, Szenes' story reached beyond borders, finding new audiences through translations, archives, and exhibitions that sought to preserve the memory of Jewish resistance during World War II. Her poems were published in more than a dozen languages, and her diary became part of university curricula in Europe and North America. In Hungary, after decades of suppression under communist rule, her legacy was officially acknowledged by the government, which posthumously cleared her of all wartime charges. The military tribunal that had condemned her was declared unlawful, and her name was restored to the National Record of Honor. Researchers uncovered court transcripts from her 1944 trial, confirming that she had refused to sign a confession and had stood unshaken before the officers who sentenced her to death. At the same time, historians traced the lives of her fellow parachutists. Some, like Yoel Palgi, survived the war and returned to Palestine, later serving in the Israeli Air Force and writing memoirs that described the mission in vivid detail. Others were captured and executed, their fates documented only through fragmented reports. Together, their stories painted a fuller picture of the Allied effort to send trained Jewish volunteers into Nazi-occupied Europe, an operation both daring and tragic in scale. The British archives revealed coded cables exchanged between Cairo and London, discussing the fate of the captured agents and the difficulty of mounting any rescue in the collapsing Axis territories. These documents, released decades after the war, confirmed that Kenna's execution had occurred just 2 months before Budapest was liberated by Soviet forces. By the early 21st century, Hannah Szenes had become one of the most studied figures of the Holocaust era. Museums in Jerusalem, Budapest, and Washington displayed her handwriting, her parachute insignia, and the wooden stool on which she had written her final poem. Scholars analyzed her work alongside Anne Frank's diary, drawing attention to the shared youth and clarity of voice that had survived even in the face of annihilation. Schools in Israel continued to teach her words as part of their literature and history lessons, while International Remembrance Days included her story among those who resisted tyranny through acts of defiance and courage. In 2010, the Hungarian Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp bearing her portrait. The same year, a new generation of Israeli paratroopers held a memorial ceremony in her honor at the site of her grave. They stood in silence before reciting her final poem, each line echoing the enduring legacy of a mission that had crossed continents and decades. The archives of the British War Office, declassified shortly thereafter, included her name among those cited for exceptional bravery. Her life, once recorded in fragments and coded messages, had become a permanent part of global history. The story of Hannah Szenes closes not in the moment of her death, but in the endurance of her words, preserved across generations. From the night she leapt into the skies over occupied Europe to the day her diary was opened to the world, her journey remains one of unbroken resolve. Time has carried her voice beyond the war she fought, into classrooms, museums, and the collective memory of nations. The girl who fell from the sky did not live to see the freedom she dreamed of, but through the written lines she left behind, she continues to speak, to remind the world that courage, even in its quietest form, can outlast the darkness that sought to silence it.